I think Jane started off this exercise the wrong way. She interviewed Millie. We're really interested in what Jane Anderson has to say. So this second half of the interview, which we've recorded, will be the three of us, and Amanda and I grilling Jane as much as she grills Amanda and myself. So sit back, enjoy this conversation. We've had 2 days of conversation with Jane, and this woman is a fount of information on all sorts of things, an incredible person for her own life journey, and you know, we'd like to share some of that with you, the members of the Catholic community as well. So Amanda's on the camera now. She's going to zoom back to get us all into the picture, and then join us in the conversation. Jane, I hope that didn't embarrass you.
No, thank you very much. It was very generous of you, Brian.
Yeah, you've had an incredible life journey in many respects. I just have admiration for you. You left school at 15, and you didn't actually. You described yourself as a farmer's wife, a shearer's cook, and then you became a secretary at a university. You knew nothing about academia and universities and study and those sort of things. And then at 35, you had some great life change. I presume the time as a secretary had something to do with it.
Actually, being a secretary happened before I became a farmer. I don't consider myself just a farmer's wife. I consider myself as a farmer because I was out there doing as much work as anyone else, yes.
The men.
I mean, I did everything except pick up the handpiece. That's
This
wool pressing, mustering, drenching, everything plus cooking.
So what led to this enormous change in your life to go from being on a farm, and you were brought up in a very isolated part of South Australia. You're on a little island.
No, originally we were from Callendale down near Narracourt, which was very new land farming. And then at the age of 6, when I was about 6, my father moved and bought a farm on High Marsh Island, which is an island where the River Murray goes out to the sea. And we had a small patch of land there, and it's the driest island in the driest state, in the driest continent. So that's where I finished primary school and went on to high school.
And you told us of your life with your brother, and I presume this was in those first 6 years, where there was nobody else. You didn't go to town. You went to town once a month.
That's right.
So it was just you and your brother and the bush.
That's right.
And one of the intriguing things you told us last night is you didn't talk. You didn't need to talk.
No.
Explain that to me. How do you get on without talking to somebody else?
Well, I suppose we did talk a bit, but you just don't have to talk. You know, you're playing under the house and you know you're not to go to scrub, and you'd be... I just can't remember. We worked in the veggie patch and we just played. We just were very quiet, you know, because we had more of the ear to what was happening around us. We lived in the middle of the bush. There was a lot of bush surrounding us. We always knew that we were not allowed to go in the bush by ourselves because that was dangerous. I mean, it was scrub. And all our life was contained in this little isolated patch there. I mean, that's all we knew. And we
would you say that interesting and very unique way of growing up for those of us that have lived in suburbia and cities, would you say that has inform the rest of your life in how you approach the rest of your life? You know, you don't need a lot of conversation, or...
In some ways it has, because I really am fascinated by people's stories and about their lives, because there wasn't a lot of language or much hustle or bustle. So, I mean, we were really Eden children, and so I am fascinated by this life I never knew. Mm-hmm. And also by language, but in some ways that's also been a struggle, because I wasn't socialised into what most people consider is ordinary, you know, being with people and having conversations, and even my own writing. I've really had to struggle. I use the thesaurus like at least once every 5 minutes, I think. So even to talk here is huge.
The other incredible part of Jane's story, she tells us, I can't believe this, she's got a PhD. She is Dr. Jane Anderson, but she tells us she hasn't spent much time on a university campus.
No.
She's done most of her study externally, off campus.
That's right.
And so it's an incredible journey from this rural existence. By the way, I should mention that Francis Brown in the Catholic community writes of a similar sort of experience to you of that. He calls it, I think, a oneness with nature.
Yeah.
And
well, that was my first church. I always regard the bush as being my first church. And I mean, I said something before about Catholic sacramentalism. The idea of sacrament. When you have your first church as the bush, you have a sense of awe, of majesty, of connection, of just being at one with the natural environment.
Yeah.
And that's very sacramental to me.
Yeah.
You know, that's God made present much more.
It's interesting, because your background was not Catholic, it was Protestant, but it was activist. You know, your parents were actively involved, is that correct?
My father, no. My mum, when we moved from this bush place, we then started going to church.
Yeah.
Because I can remember only a couple of times going to church before the age of 5 or 6 when we moved.
But did you have a sense of God when you were in that early part of your life?
Well, probably didn't know it that it was, but you do have a sense of something bigger, and there's a presence, there's like a God energy, I would call it now. Yeah. I guess we didn't have the language to name it.
Yeah.
We didn't have a language to name a lot of things because it wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
That was familiar, you know. Yeah. You don't have to name things. Once you start naming things, you start categorising them and putting them in places. But
and
when it's your own,
to some extent.
That's right. Yeah. But when that's your place and you're familiar with it, you don't have to. There's no point in organising it. It's
you're a deep thinker.
Am I?
Well, that's what comes across to me.
Right.
And when the Catholic thing came in was when you married and had children, and you know you were asked to raise your children as Catholic and all that sort of thing. And then I gather from what you told us over the last couple of days that it was, you didn't so much become a Catholic as you were doing the practical stuff for your children, you know, in the schools and that sort of thing. But eventually you became pretty much involved in doing liturgy and stuff within the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Is that a good summary of what you told us yesterday? In terms of the transition to the Catholic?
Yeah, I knew that was going to be an issue because my then husband's family was very Catholic.
Right.
And they were the pillars of their community. But I took religion very seriously, really, and I made a decision that if I was to become a Catholic, it wasn't fait accompli before that, that I would, and I took 2 years of study and thinking about it before I was married, whether that was the right path for me.
Deep thinker. That's what I meant.
Well, when you don't have language exterior, when you don't socialise, it all happens within you, really.
Yeah.
So
now, can we get on to these fascinating studies that you've been doing, which are so bizarre in a way because nobody else in the world has done them. Firstly, the one on clerical intimacy. Intimacy's been a big issue for me. You know, I went through 10 years after my marriage failed. My first marriage failed, and in the end, and I seriously considered taking up some sort of vocation or moving into some sort of association. What do they call them? Associate communities, like, you know, so some of the religious orders have associates.
Secular.
Yeah. And you know, but they live in community and so on. I considered that with the Christian Brothers. In the end, the issue was, for me, was not about sex. It was about intimacy. That I had a sense that everybody in life needs a soulmate, and the ultimate meaning of marriage is not about getting physically undressed in front of somebody. It's a sense of undressing your soul. There's some person whom you can trust with your deepest vulnerabilities, and you know that you're never going to be betrayed about that. And I think every person needs that. Now, it's a very Catholic thought in that, you know, this is where the whole idea of confession and reconciliation came from, that we need somebody who we can unload to, who we can share our fears and our vulnerabilities to in complete trust. Now, what did you learn in that whole study? Well, let's go back to the beginning. How, you put out advertisements through the National Council of Priests and other places, and you eventually got responses from priests, and you interviewed them, and it was all about intimacy in their lives. Is that correct?
Well, it's really about their particular friendships, which would be considered generally by the institution as illicit.
Right.
What my interest personally was to find out a broader understanding of sexuality and gender, and this was this group that I could learn for myself. I haven't said this very well. I could discover for myself a better sense of relationship. How do relationships work? Anyhow, that hasn't been said too well. But
so how many came forward?
Okay.
Yeah, out of your requests, and how many did you speak to face to face or via questionnaires and so on?
Really, I didn't speak to hardly any face to face.
Right.
It was only a core group that wanted to come and meet me, and then we had quite long sessions and conversation. I mean, over a number of years, some of them. A third of them were anonymous. Some were by telephone, some written, all sorts of different ways of communicating, whatever they felt comfortable with. And
that was a core group of about 50, I gather, in the end.
Yes.
Okay, and this led, you got your PhD from this, and you got very high rating for it, I gather.
Yes.
And that's actually what's led on and given you the fellowship and the funding to undertake this new study, which surprisingly is through a secular institution. I doubt if any Catholic institute would have funded or been game to take on this sort of research. Now, with the initial study, do you reach any conclusions about the intimacy issue? How big an issue is it for men trying to live a celibate life? You know, do they struggle with it? You know, I think you told us some men do reach an accommodation with celibacy. What's your overall picture? I don't know if you can summarise it, the whole book in 2 sentences, but...
What I found was that those that took the risk of engaging in an intimate relationship, that really rounded out their humanity. And I would say that those particular priests were very pastorally capable. There were some that obviously couldn't resolve some of those issues, and there are also a number that I interviewed that not only embraced that intimacy and it contributed to the fullness of humanity, they also made the decision for them to leave and get married or partner with whomever. In fact, I think those particular priests used my research to be able to work through those issues about what direction their life would take.
And I gather that, you know, what your research also uncovered is that there are men in the clerical state who do have long-term relationships. Some are sexual, but some are non-sexual as well, but the intimacy factor is important to them.
Yeah, what I found with a number of religious priests who were religious but who had relationships with religious sisters, that it may have been sexual at the beginning, but then they work through that and decide to maintain that intimate relationship, which really is a love relationship, and live celibately and meet up. You know, they'll go in their particular directions, whatever their vocation's calling to them.
The thing is that intimacy is not a one-size-fits-all, so did you have to define what you meant by intimacy when you started?
Actually, the intimacy was something that came out of the research. I was really looking at compulsory celibacy and understand that in the culture of the Catholic Church. But these issues of intimacy came to the fore, and the best relationships between the priests and the women, and a few had male partners too. I mean, it wasn't just straight priests, it was also gay priests, was that they had very mutually rewarding relationships within the parameter of the relationship. And I say that because in a more public or the church sphere, it was a very, I mean, there were hierarchies of power. It was a very, you know, the women or the partners were invisible. It was
you mentioned that, and it was going to be my next question, was you were focusing on the cleric who was, you know, in a relationship. But there's another half to that, and that is the women.
Yes.
Sometimes,
or men,
or sometimes they might have been in a religious order or something. What about that other half? Did you have any contact with them? You know, interviews or survey information come back from them, and do you have impressions of how they handle it? Because that's one of the things I find hard to understand.
Well, really that would have been another study, because there are whole different sets of issues about power and how they understand some of the issues I looked at, like morality and identity, but I think the gender issue would have become much more to the fore, and homosexuality, and I think those sorts of issues would have come much more to the fore than what came to the fore with the priests, who had to deal a lot more with the institution. Yeah. Okay, I had a sense. I think the partners of the priests had it really tough, and continue to have it tough, because they're rendered invisible, and I think some of them are quite heroic. In the health, those that continue to have long-term relationships, and sometimes, like I came across one priest who said he'd been in a relationship for 40 years. Now that is more than many have for their marriage.
Yeah.
You know, I think, like I said, I think they do it really tough, and I think they are their ministry through that relationship is so invisible. They give so much to the church and to society, but it disappears. It's not there.
Unacknowledged.
And
That's
it
right.
can't be acknowledged under the present structure. Now, what about, did you pick up any feelings out of your research as to how priests deal with celibacy? You know, do they ever think about it before they become priests, or you know, are they given in training in how to be celibate? You know, or is it the old-fashioned thing of just don't talk about it? You know, and the poor blokes just have to try and cope in a very singular thing on their own, a very lonely sort of journey. What did you find?
Well, most of the priests that I interviewed came out of that Vatican II. They were the ministerial sorts of priests, and when they went in, there was hardly anything said about celibacy, and and it wasn't an issue for them in the seminary, and sometimes it wasn't an issue when they were sort of neophytes, when they first came to be first ministered as priests. But then when they started ministering in new areas where there are lots of babies and all that sort of side of the life, then they started maybe to think about it. But then some others also, when they came to 45, 50, where that midlife crisis comes about, and I think they, you know, really started thinking about what they hadn't experienced in life, and also recognised their need for a love relationship, for intimacy, because that's how we very much know our humanness, you know, the self behind the person, and especially the self behind the person of the priest, who is set apart and quite
ontologically changed.
Ontologically changed.
Listen, thanks for spending the time on that. I know, because you've told us, Jane's told us that she's really past all this. This was the research that she did, I don't know, 10 years ago, is it, or 5 years ago, and it resulted in a very successful book that's been sold internationally, and that helped her get the support that she needed to undertake this new research. So let's get on to talk about that, which is probably even more interesting, although it has connections obviously to where you came from.
The oxymoron that is progressive Catholicism.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what led you to doing a study like this? And what have you found out so far? I know you're only halfway through the research, but what are you trying to find out, and where did it start?
I want to know, like most people, where is our church going forward? Not restorationists. We know a lot of what's happening there, and it is dying on the vine, seriously, and it's collapsing. But where is the future for at least some expressions of Catholicism? So I've had the privilege to get this fellowship from University of Western Australia to try and tease out and explore what is possible, what is possibly going on.
Obviously what you have picked up is that there is such a thing as progressive Catholicism, and there are groups that are meeting. I certainly found this both of us found it when we had these conversations at the American Catholic Council in Detroit recently, that there seemed to be a lot of these underground, below the radar, small groups, 10, 20, 30, 40 people, who are meeting and who are doing sort of liturgies and so on, but you know, they're not advertising themselves on the internet or, you know, in bulletins and that sort of thing. They tend to be groups coming together. Now, you've discovered some of that.
Yeah.
What sort of trends do you see sort of emerging?
Well, first I'll tell you, this label progressive, it came about, it became a lot more evident that we were using, the media was using this term progressive after the 9/11, okay? Yeah. So instead of describing Catholics as liberals, we started describing them as progressives. So we're taking on a new sort of identity. And what I understand is the liberals tend to talk about how to be church, whereas progressives are very much about, well, we're going to start practicing what we're trying to say we are. Okay, so that's one of the defining characteristics that I would associate with progressives. Now, progressives tend to exercise some sense of autonomy, either semi-autonomy from the church, that is that they're hidden, they could be in parishes, they could be happening under the radar of the scrutiny of what we might call the God Squad or the Frozen Chosen or whatever your favourite term is.
Temple Police is the new term.
The Temple Police. Yeah. But then what I've found is that there are some groups that have taken up, they have spontaneously emerged on the margins, and Catholica is one of them. I mean, really, a lay person like you has created the possibility for this community, and people have come in on it, and I think that's still that Catholic sense. I think that's what defines us defines us from being Protestant, which is much more individually oriented. Catholics talk about we, they don't talk about I. So they have this sense of wanting to be in a community. They come into the fullness of who they are as persons, as faith people in a community. So I think that is still that heritage, that Catholic imagination that is drawing to us despite what's happening. So that's one thing. Now, what I'm finding is that these communities are moving from that ecclesiastical cult where the priest always has to be the mediator between God and the people. Progressives are tending towards being what we would call in anthropology a communal cult. So it's much more egalitarian, for example. Now, that egalitarianism is relative to the ecclesiastical system where they come out of. There still can be hierarchies, but the ideal is more an egalitarianism.
Could I perhaps put in a little explanation here that your actual area of expertise is anthropology, isn't it? That's what the driving interest and focusing all these studies that you've been doing has been an anthropological interest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which doesn't focus on the individual. It focuses on the group and the culture.
That's one thing. There are so many things we've been talking about for the last 2 days. I want to include them all in this interview.
I think we should just have had the cameras running the whole time.
Yeah, but we can't do that. But the two or three of the things I'd like to take up is that one is that we thing, which you've just sort of touched on there. The second one is the one of fear, which we were talking about a little while ago, you know, as one of the big drivers in what's going on in society at the moment. And I forget what the third one is, but it'll come to me.
We probably won't have time anyway.
Yeah. So let's come back to the we thing. You've made this point quite a bit in our conversations of the difference between the Catholic outlook. We've been talking a lot about the Catholic imagination or Catholic thought. You know, one of the interesting trends today seems to be that Catholics are not leaving the church or dropping out of participation or stopping listening to the Pope and then wanting to become Anglicans or Calathumpians or Buddhists or something. There's a small group that do that, but the mainstream just drop out. But they still want to identify as Catholic. Now you've got some views on this about this I-we thing, which is a difference between Catholics and others. Where does it come from? Why do you think it is?
Sandra Snyder's a religious in America. She would say that there are two avenues in which Catholicity is maintained. One is through the institution, and one is through our Catholic heritage. And what I've found with some of the people I've interviewed is their family heritage, which is Catholic, is very much a part of their identity. It's not just the institution. So it's a part of who they understand themselves to be. No. So already that maintains sort of a kin relationship. It's a part of the substance of their family identity.
See, I often say when I'm presenting music to a congregation, for instance, I say, you know, you have Hillsong and those wonderful things that really focus on Jesus is my personal Lord and Saviour.
Yes.
Whereas when we're dealing with Catholic worship, we are the body of Christ. So part of our Catholic identity is really centred around the body of Christ, a collective that we belong to, if you will. And it seems to be a fundamentally different way of approaching that whole, well, particularly worship, but the whole faith question, isn't it?
Thanks, Amanda. You've got me a little bit on track now. Okay. With the Calvinistic line, that because they took away the priesthood, the mediatory cultic priesthood, the emphasis was on the individual to ensure that he was living a Christian life. So it was the
and it's according to the word, isn't it? Very much according to the word, the gospel.
Well, they got rid of the hierarchy, they got rid of the sacraments, so it was sola scriptura, basically.
That's right, yeah.
So it was very much, the emphasis was on the individual to be the Christian, and there was a lot of pressures for the individual to conform to what was expected of them. Whereas for the Catholic, it was different. It was much more tribal, it was mediated
by the community, or
by the community,
by the social standards of the community, rather than by this is what God says. You know, that you fit it into the community, you fit it into the culture, the social mores, the laws of that community, the cultural laws of that community as to how you behaved.
Yeah, and the community would actually take up your sin, so it wouldn't shame the community. You were very much a part of the community.
And cushioned by the community in some respects.
That's right, because if you did something wrong, the community would somehow ameliorate that wrong to ensure you maintained in that community. But whereas in the Protestant sect, the emphasis, the sin was on the individual.
Right.
You know, it was between you and God, not between you and the community and God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a fascinating perspective on that. And what implications do you have? One of the criticisms that's been made in some literature that I've read in the last few weeks is that George Pell in his new translation is taking us back to this individualist, the sort of almost Protestant view of the relationship of the individual to God. And there's actually been some criticism of the wording, which is, rather than what Amanda's talking about, we the body of Christ, it's more the Hillsong, me God relationship. You know, I've got to conform, you know, and obey all the rules and that sort of thing. And yeah, that's fascinating what you're saying now.
Yeah, and I probably haven't said it to be that well, to be honest. Sometimes you should do your homework before the interviews. But with what I think that's happening, I think that George Pearl and Benedict, they're assuming community. So the individual has to give a very devotional response, and the emphasis is on it comes across as though the emphasis is on the individual. But really, I think the more orthodox or the more restorationist Catholics are assuming community. But progressives, I don't believe, are assuming community. We have to make community. We have to actively participate to ensure that we have a community. But, you know, community.
You don't leave it to somebody else.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I mean, you know, other trends that you've seen emerging. For instance, you know, last night we were talking about the pluralistic society in which we live. Can you speak a little bit more to that in what you're finding as your research sort of progresses? Right.
Well, just one thing that might be interesting. I think in society we're moving away from the autonomous individual. So this idea of a more person-centred rather than just self, I think there's something happening here. And I think that may also explain this progressive movement in some ways in the direction it's going.
Yeah, just a quick question before we get onto the fear thing. I want to get onto the fear thing because it's...
I want to hear more about that.
But the pluralistic thing, you know, it's not just pluralism in society as a whole. We fairly accept that. I mean, I think that is fairly acceptable in Australia's society. We have so many different sorts of groups.
Mm.
In the church, though, the institutional church doesn't want a pluralistic church. It wants a homogenous, universalist church, you know, a singular sort of church. Yeah, I know there's a word for it, like it slips my mind. But this downward pressure that the institution is putting on the local church or the grassroots church is actually creating a pluralist church because it is fragmenting. So progressives are finding different ways of being Catholic.
Yeah, and this is what you said a while ago. Father Dan Donovan's commentary today in Catholica was saying that, you know, if this continues, they're actually all going to be fighting with one another once they get the full control. Just the question I was going to interrupt with a minute ago was, how big do you think this progressive Catholicism is? You know, is it the wide masses who are interested in exploring this, or is it some sort of equivalent to the remnant, you know, of the other side? It's the 5% of the intellectuals or the deep thinkers or the social justice people or whatever. What's your impression as to what the relative, how much interest is there in these things you're talking about?
Well, I think it's a very emerging movement. It's really what I think is the serious religious seekers. That I think they are the ones that are carrying this movement. Yeah. You know, whether that remains the case, you know, who knows. Yeah. But progressives generally have a tertiary education, or they have some association with higher learning. So they have a lot of critical skills, and they tend to give deep thinking to this. But it's not just the cognitive content of their faith life. They are looking for a more holistic faith life, which will take into account their feelings, emotions, other sorts of knowledges, their experience. They'll look at, they'll try and contemporize images. They very much operate out of metaphor, not just this linear, literalist type of thinking. They are looking for a more enriched way to live their lives. They want to expand the sense of who they are as individuals. So even when they're looking for community, they're not, what comes up is they're not trying to subjugate themselves to the community. That community is there to help them to become more enriched persons. You know, there's a lot of optimism out there. There's, you know, it's not going to be an easy journey, and we don't know. We really are in the desert with this. But there is a lot more bubbling up. Like you said before, there are communities. We don't know. I'm surprised at the little communities that I'm hearing about. And I'll never get to interview everyone, but there is a lot of goodwill, a lot of good thinking, a lot of energy to just try and live Christianity in the Catholic tradition in this place and time. You know, there's something effervescent. And it hasn't realised itself yet. It's ambiguous.
Well, it's an organic process, isn't it? And these things are never, as you say, they're not linear, and they don't just follow the nice straight path.
Yeah, there's no straight path.
There's no straight path. And I think that that's true when you're talking about anything that's of the spirit, is that it's characterised by diversity and colour, you know, shades of all sorts of things. And that it seems to me, from my experience of moving around lots of different communities, is that there are these networks between all of these little communities. So you're not talking about climbing Jacob's ladder, you're talking about dancing Sarah's circle, that there's actually a fundamentally different way of being church emerging. But it doesn't look like anything we've had before. Or actually, that's not true. It actually looks a little bit like what Jesus started, which is, I think, ultimately what Vatican II was trying to get to and not achieving it, but a step along the way. Maybe it's that all of this, the restorationist kind of turning back the clock, is forcing the very thing that they most don't want to happen is actually happening. Well, I think that's actually a very good thing, personally.
Yeah, there's that downward pressure is actually
causing that,
creating an effervescence at the local level.
That's right.
So, but what I think's happening is we're not having these hierarchical structures, it's networking. And Catholica and the internet is a key factor in the ability to network. And there are a number of, I mean, there's all sorts of progressive movements. I mean, there's progressive theologians, there's progressive movements within schools, but the groups I tend to be looking at are those that are activists, those that are looking at social justice, for instance, the contemplatives, those groups that engage in Lectio Divina or Christian meditation, and then those that are reform-minded, who still see the value of the institution. And there is a value of the institution. We need organisation, but we need an organisation that actually helps us along, not restricts us and constrains us from finding a genuine
And of course,
path.
for such an organisation to be understandable even in this day and age, it needs to be characterised by things like transparency and accountability and all of those sorts of things that we're always banging on about on Catholica.
It's a democratic system, really. I mean, accountability and transparency is the ethical part of what it means to live in a democracy. And the progressive movement, in a way, is about democratising the church.
Now, in your interview with Amanda, which you were asking some of the questions which are in your questionnaire, which a lot of other people are being asked around the country. And not all of them, but you just took some of the big questions like, you know, what is your view of God today? Do you think society's view of God is changing? Is the progressive element within Catholicism expressing a new interpretation or understanding of God or the divine or this mystery, or however you describe it. How do you define God, and what are you finding from your research as to how people are responding to that sort of question?
Okay, well, I'll include another question about the fear.
All right, you're most welcome.
What I find is that the further progressives get away from the institution, the further they become involved in their community and get the sustenance they're looking for, and they find their own voice, because that's where they have the conversations. And when you start articulating these things within your heart, it becomes much more clearer, and you arrive at an understanding. And once you have understanding, you can determine the meaning of your faith life and meaning of life. So the progressive movements, their degree, I recognise that their degree of fear is diminishing in relation to the church. So when that happens...
Just let me clarify that. What you mean is they're less fearful of the institution, you know, that they're going to excommunicate or burn somebody at the stake or something.
Yeah, that's... it doesn't have the power over their lives that it may once have.
Right.
And when they start voicing their own feelings, their own thinking, their own memories, their preferred images, they arrive at an understanding which leads to meaning. So they begin to get an alternative meaning, but one that has very much relevance to their life in this particular time and place.
Right. And the view of God then is how's that being articulated?
So when they have less fear, and they also start to jettison previous understandings of what God is. Okay? Yeah. So they're not, I mean, this was one surprise. They are rethinking that God isn't necessarily a Trinity. Some people still value that, and they've been able to adapt their thinking about God, about the Trinitarian God, in a way that makes sense to them. But some others aren't. And God is, for them, is mystery, but God is, they could say God is energy, God is a verb. I mean, that's very Matthew Fox, but they also call God as a value. It's not God as a parent, a mother or father, but God is our guardian, the creator God's a favourite one. They use a lot of values that they connect with God, God of whatever value, and I can't call, God of
mercy, God of compassion,
but more contemporary values too, and I'm trying to think of one.
They're older fashioned ones, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
My favourite is the God of surprises.
Yeah, well, there you go, God of surprises. But and for Jesus may not be a divine character. He certainly is an exemplar, but he's an historical person rather than this divine person as well.
That is coming through, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Because one of the things, if I can give a view on an impression that comes to me, across to me from Catholica, it's in many ways surprising to me, because I'm really quite a conservative person, and that was my background.
Before you met me.
Well, yes, maybe. Is that even on a community like Catholica, people rejecting things that I would have thought, in some cases I disagree quite strongly. For example, the way original sin has been ditched. and you know, people are going on about original grace and that sort of thing. Now, we haven't got time for the long conversation we had yesterday about original sin, but you know, I think those foundational stories, which are not just Catholic, they're Christian, they come from Judaism. You know, the unfortunate thing is they've all become literalised, whereas they weren't literal in the first place. Though Carl Armstrong is a great writer on this. It's the mythos of the story, not the logos of the story, and it's trying to give us an understanding of big picture. You know, why is the human condition like it is? Why is suffering in the world is the big one. It seems to me that there is a rejection of quite fundamental things. Like, one of the other big issues that's come up is the creed itself. You know, people blatantly coming out and saying, you know, I simply don't say it anymore because I don't believe it, or in other cases, I don't believe these particular sentences in it. So,
in fact, at the American Catholic Council, in the final liturgy, we prayed a creed that left out the bits we don't like and put in bits we did. And it's actually I found it to be a beautiful and very holistic creed, but yeah, things are changing.
yeah.
And I think it's about, the problem is that's a very prescribed creed, but progressives are really trying to give thinking to, well, what is the explanation for faith? Because basically creed is just an explanation.
Well, that's, again, you know, we've had this discussion over the last couple of days, and I think it's another issue that we could take up, and we could have another 2-hour conversation. We're not going to have that, but the remnant element are taking it back. You must believe this. Now, I'd argue the faith view that I've come to, the spiritual view that I've come to, is that Catholicism ultimately is not about creeds. You know, Jesus is not about creeds. He didn't come and give us a bloody creed. You know, what he came and gave us was the Sermon on the Mount. He gave us a way of negotiating life. You know, you're not going to be judged on what you believed. You are going to be judged, if you're going to be judged, on how you responded to the challenges of life. Not, you know, standing on the street corner saying, you know, I'm never going to commit these sins, I'm never going to have an abortion, I'm never going to fornicate or whatever. But it is how you respond when your daughter comes home and she is pregnant and she is thinking of having an abortion, or, you know, your elderly parents are suffering greatly, and how do you assist them at the end of their life journey.
So in the final analysis, I suppose the question is, do you find that progressive Catholics are jettisoning certain things that have been maybe unquestioned articles of belief?
Well, actually, can I just get back to Brian? I think I'll answer your question. That was very typical. What you just said was very typical progressive. The problem is that the creeds are being imposed as if they were doctrine. Okay, now if creed was looked on as a story or metaphor, that would be different. Progressives are generally rejecting or jettisoning doctrine. They want story. That's why the gospel, like you were saying, the Beatitudes, that is a story, a special story, a myth that they can unpack. It isn't being constrained by doctrine. They unpack this myth and try to apply to their local situation. Again, it's restoring or empowering the local as against this universal uniformity that's been imposed.
I think we should wind this one up now. It'll perhaps give people a taste for your research. It will give us some indication of where your research is going. It will encourage people to come forward, but hopefully it will also assist us greatly at Catholica in providing some of the territory that we can unpack a little bit too in our discussions as we go along. Jane, thank you very much.
Thank you for everyone that's going to contribute to my research. I really appreciate this. There's a long way to go, and this is only, you know, the immediate, you know, this is only some of the things I'm finding out. There's a long way to go there.